Hey everyone, this is a book review uh, by Haberkern of Bruno Rizzi's The Bureaucratization of the World, translated by Adam Westoby. Um, the book was originally published in 1985, and I'm not sure what year the article is from. The review is from 1985. Yes, 1985 as well. So, same year. And this is in Telos. Here it goes. Bruno Rizzi is one of those authors whose reputation is in inverse proportion to the number of people who have read his work. Indeed, in Rizzi's case, it is in inverse proportion to those who have even seen his work. The translation by Adam Westoby of the first third of the book, La Bureaucratisation du Monde, which is the source of his notoriety, can only make the situation worse. Now his reputation will be based on the opinions of people who think they have read his book. Who is Bruno Rizzi and why is his name known while his work is not? He is known because he had become involved in a dispute between a far more prominent figure, Leon Trotsky, and his followers. A dispute which had, and continues to have, an effect on anyone seriously concerned with the nature and origin of the new social system that arose in Russia in the 30s. In 1937, several of Trotsky's supporters, notably James Burnham and Joseph Carter in America and Ivan Crépieux in France, raised objections to the continued reference to Russia as a workers' state, albeit a, quote, degenerated, end quote, workers' state, which had to be defended against capitalist attack because it continued to protect nationalized property. Basing themselves in large measure on Trotsky's own work, especially The Revolution Betrayed, published in 1936, these dissidents argued that nationalized property had become the basis of a new class, the bureaucracy. The working class had been deprived of all rights and all control over this state property. The recent experience of the Moscow trials, in which the pitiful remnants of the revolutionary generation had been broken and disgraced, while throughout the country thousands of rank-and-file communist workers, the last survivors of the party that had made the 1917 revolution, were quietly shipped off to camps, made this clear. Meanwhile, in Spain, the Russian, quote, advisors, end quote, to the Republican government were organizing and leading the assault on labor organizations. In effect, they established there the same sort of totalitarian control over the working class as they had achieved in Russia. It was in response to this debate that an unknown, isolated, and, to put it charitably, eccentric Italian ex-socialist, Bruno Rizzi, published La Bureaucratisation du Monde. The significance of this book is not that Rizzi invented the idea that the bureaucracy was a new class. That claim had already been put forward by Burnham, Carter, and Crépieux, whose attacks on Trotsky were the starting point for Rizzi, as he himself makes clear in La Bureaucratisation. Westoby, in his introduction to the English translation, also recognizes this. In any case, the ideas were in the air and had long been put forward by others. What Rizzi did was to take Trotsky's argument that an economic system based on nationalized property was a progressive step forward for mankind, even if the nationalized property was controlled by a repressive, indeed totalitarian state, and turn it into an open apology for Stalinism and for fascism. It is just this apologia which is practically eliminated in Westoby's translation. The last two sections in which this theme is developed as nauseam are dropped, and Westoby's introduction mentions Rizzi's pro-fascism and anti-Semitism as if they were just personal aberrations instead of the central theme of Rizzi's book. The debate over Trotsky's, quote, Trotsky's equation, quote, nationalized property equals socialism, end quote, is not mentioned in the introduction. Even in a short review such as this, a brief outline of Rizzi's theories and, even more important, the political conclusions Rizzi drew from them can indicate the extent to which the present translation bowdlerizes the original book. Rizzi was, for a brief time, a member of the Italian Socialist Party. After Mussolini's rise to power, Rizzi appears by all accounts to have dropped out of politics. The myth that he had something to do with Trotskyism, a myth begun by Trotsky himself, appears to have no other foundation than Rizzi's attempt to intervene in the 1937 debate. The Italian Trotskyists in emigration regarded him as politically abhorrent and suspected him of being a spy. This was before he wrote La Bureaucratisation and stemmed from his pro-fascism, not from his advocacy of a new class theory which was then supported by leading members of French and American Trotskyist groups. See the exchange of letters in Le Contrat Social for 1958, especially the letters from Pierre Neville for a description of Rizzi's reception by the Italian Trotskyists. Rizzi earned his living as a shoe salesman. Rizzi earned his living as a shoe salesman. Westoby's introduction seems to indicate he was a pretty good one, and he traveled extensively throughout Europe in that capacity. The ease with which he entered and left Italy lent strength to the suspicion of socialists and other opponents of fascism concerning Rizzi, who attempted to counter this by claiming to have been a victim of police harassment. At most, if his own accounts are to be taken seriously, this harassment amounted to being arrested and let go after a couple of hours of questioning. The police never seem to have considered him a political oppositionist, and in fact, on a number of occasions, he attempted to peddle his ideas to the fascist authorities as well as Mussolini, Hitler, and Stalin personally. He also liked Roosevelt's Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace, but, as far as is known, did not send him his work. Some light is thrown on Rizzi's attempt to portray himself as something other than a simple apologist for fascism if we look at the history of his book. It was impounded shortly after its publication, and Rizzi claimed this was done by the Nazis after the fall of France. In fact, Westoby has discovered the evidence in court records that it was banned by the Popular Front government because of its viciously anti-Semitic diatribes in the sections Westoby has not translated. Whatever one thinks as a good civil libertarian of the French government's practice then and now of press censorship, it does present a different picture of Rizzi and how people saw Rizzi's book at the time it was originally banned, not by the Nazis for being pro-socialist, but by the French socialist government for being anti-Semitic. Rizzi's thesis was based on the proposition that the working class had failed. It had no further role to play except as an ally of fascism and Stalinism, of the new bureaucratic ruling class in any of its forms against the plutocracies, i.e. England and France. The rhetoric was similar to, and predated, the rhetoric of the Nazis and fascists during the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Anti-imperialist denunciations reminiscent of socialist World War I anti-war propaganda were freely tossed about by Rizzi as they were later by the fascists and by their then allies in the Third International. Such attacks were directed exclusively at British and French capitalism. The bureaucracy, not the working class, Rizzi claimed was to take over for a discredited the bureaucracy, not the working class, Rizzi claimed, was to take over from a discredited capitalism mired in the depths of economic depression. Quote, socialism is, in the final analysis, an economy of distribution and division of products. It is not possible until production is so vast that any increase in consumption, even an increase in the requirements of the state, is met. Overproduction at present is nothing but the saturation of the capitalist market. To provide what is required for the inhabitants of the earth, the maximum production of 1929 has to be multiplied. A task of that kind cannot be met by capitalism and its supporters who, after having murdered 10 million men from 1914 to 1918, are reminded to recommence their, quote, immortal principles, end quote, what their, quote, immortal principles, end quote, demand. Such a task is assumed by the state and by the class which has the courage to make itself master of the state. Only the productivity of the state, not the speculation of individuals, rationalized, perfected, electrified, can give a new impulse to production and achieve greater wealth for humanity, ... End quote. The Bureaucratization of the World, pages 239 to 240. The class that was to exercise this mastery was the bureaucracy. Quote, the possession of the state gives the bureaucracy possession of all goods, movable and immovable, which, in being socialized, do not any the less belong, quote, in toto, end quote, to the new ruling class. This form of society resolves, from the social point of view, the unsustainable antagonism which renders capitalist society incapable of any progress. In capitalist society, the form of production has been collective for a long time, because the whole world takes part, directly or indirectly, in the production of every kind of good. But the appropriation of goods is individual, that in consequence precisely of private property. In socializing property and submitting property effectively to the direction of a class, acting as a complex harmony, the antagonism that exists in the capitalist system is made to disappear, replaced by a new system, end quote. In Westerby's translation, this passage can be found on page 50. The task of the bureaucracy was to create the space for the full development of, quote, the productive forces, end quote, to divide up the world into 6 or 7 great, quote, autarchies, end quote, which would provide adequate raw materials and markets for the new planned economy, not to mention a fantastic market for shoe salesmen. It's in parentheses. What political consequences followed from this? Quote, far from us is the desire or wish to be brutal with respect to those little peoples who are highly civilized and live tranquilly and inoffensively. We believe it will not be necessary to sacrifice them completely, and that they will of their own accord attach themselves to the autarky that offers them the most favorable conditions of economic integration. But if one wishes peace in the world and the growth of production, it is necessary to find a peaceful means to provide space and the raw materials necessary for the construction of the German and Italian autarchies. The sacrifice of the independence of some small state or other is a necessity long since proved for the development of the economy, since the autarky has, as the autarky's aim, economic organization and not political hegemony. It will not even be wise to deal harshly in the matter of the customs, languages, culture, and liberty of the populations, end quote. This was written between the rape of Czechoslovakia by the Nazis and the dismemberment of Poland by Hitler and Stalin. Both of these actions were, as is well known, taken to preserve peace in the world. Rizzi is the only political figure I know of who attempted to develop a full-blown principled defense of the Hitler-Stalin Pact before it happened. Quote, at this historical conjuncture, in order to provide space and raw materials for fascism and National Socialism, Rizzi here refers to Russia, that is to say, to divide the world in a rational manner and then exploit it rationally, Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, and the world proletariat must ally themselves to ward off the last blow of the old sorcerer of capitalism, end quote. The Bureaucratization of the World. Quote, the proletariat must convince itself, and soon, that the fascist movements are a kind of anti-capitalist movement. They must demand an alliance with them. The proletariat must push for a creation of an anti-capitalist bloc, to which it will adhere all the national anti-capitalist forces, that is to say, the fascist forces which have detached themselves from capitalism, and the petty bourgeoisie who will provide the largest number of technicians for the new ruling class, end quote. Nor did Rizzi flinch from advocating anti-Semitism as the cement of such a workers' fascist alliance. Quote, we respect the honor Marx and Trotsky and a few others of our obscure friends of the Jewish race. Certain isolated and very beautiful flowers can grow in dung heaps, but as a whole the Jewish people have become a capitalist pile of shit, end quote. Given this self-portrait, that's from Bureaucratization of the World. I guess I'm assuming that's the untranslated part. Given this self-portrait, is it any wonder that the French and Italian Trotskyists who came in contact with Rizzi shunned him? How then did he come to be taken seriously by Trotsky? In 1939, the Hitler-Stalin Pact shattered the political calculations of all parties. Trotsky in particular was sent reeling. How could one continue to defend the USSR in this situation? Trotsky responded to his critics' attacks within his own movement by taking a self-contradictory position. The Stalinist bureaucracy is defending nationalized property, and in this we must support the Stalinist bureaucracy. However, the Stalinist bureaucracy does not play a generally progressive role because the Stalinist bureaucracy cannot spread this progressive system outside its borders. Only the organized class which Stalin is destroying can do that. Nevertheless, Trotsky's dissident supporters, again led by Carter and Burnham, pointed out that Stalin was setting up a statified system in occupied Poland. Stalin was overthrowing capitalism. Unable to meet these objections, Trotsky counterattacked by dragging into the fray the unfortunate Rizzi, whom the American Trotskyists had never heard of, and whose writings they knew only from the scattered quotes Trotsky included in his polemics. If you say, Trotsky's argument went, that the bureaucracy is a new ruling class, then like Rizzi you must conclude that the working class is doomed. The bureaucracy, not the working class, is the wave of the future. The majority of the Trotskyist movement, disoriented by the pact between fascism and what they considered a worker state, cannot handle this attack. Burnham, for one, simply collapsed. Within the year he had adopted the essentials of Rizzi's pro-fascist position, without the anti-Semitism to be sure. Westerby does do a good job of debunking the myth that Burnham plagiarized Rizzi, a myth which is still being repeated among others, John Gross, who reviewed the new translation for the New York Times. Outside of the fact that there is no evidence that Burnham or anyone else in the Western Hemisphere besides Trotsky had seen a copy of the book, and outside of the fact that Burnham's thesis that the managers, not the bureaucrats proper, were the new ruling class was counterposed to Rizzi's, there remains the fact that Burnham attacked the bureaucracy as a new class at least a year before Rizzi. Rizzi, by his own admission, was provoked to rethink the question of Russia by the debate initiated by Burnham, among others. Carter, however, the other participant in the 1937 debate, reacted to the Hitler-Stalin Pact by thinking through the argument of Trotsky's revolution betrayed. The issue was not the bureaucracy's sociological status. Whether the bureaucracy was a caste, class, or society of friends, it was defending tooth and nail the collective property it had wrested from the working class against any and every private property-owning class. It was extending that system where and when it could. Was that progress or not? Should socialists support that or not? Trotsky himself in the 1937 debate had made the issue, quote, "Now we learn that in place of the bourgeois society, there has been established a new class society. Crépieux has not given it a name nor analyzed its internal laws, but that does not prevent us from seeing that this new society is progressive in comparison with capitalism. For on the basis of nationalized property, the new, quote, possessing class, end quote, has assured a development of the productive forces never equaled in the history of the world. Marxism teaches, does it not, that the productive forces are the fundamental factor of historic progress. A society which is not capable of assuring the growth of the productive forces is still less capable of assuring the well-being of the working masses, whatever may be the mode of distribution. The antagonism between feudalism and capitalism, and the decline of feudalism, has been determined precisely by the fact that the latter opened up new and grandiose possibilities for the stagnating progressive forces. The same applies to the USSR. Whatever its model of exploitation may be, this new society is, by its very character, superior to capitalist society. There you have the real point of departure for Marxist analysis, end quote. Trotsky, Internal Bulletin of the Socialist Workers Party. Whether this was Marxism or not, it certainly posed the question under discussion sharply. Westerby appears to be ignorant of this whole area of debate, although it is essential to understanding Rizzi. In particular, he appears to be unaware of the decade-long dispute between Carter and Max Shachtman. Max Shachtman was one of Trotsky's former adherents who by 1940 had been convinced that the bureaucracy in Russia was a new ruling class, but that collectivist property represented, quote, a new, more advanced form of property, end quote, in defense of which socialists might, under certain conditions, quote, fight in the army of Stalin, end quote. As Carter pointed out, such a position led politically to Trotsky's old conclusions. Unlike Rizzi and Burnham, and like most other leftists, Shachtman simply dismissed the anti-capitalist claims of the fascists because capitalist property had not been finally liquidated. The awkward question raised by Rizzi, does fascist encroachment on capitalist property represent a progressive tendency, was simply dodged by most socialists but not by all. Although fascists have generally suffered from a bad press since they lost World War II, the fascists did attract significant, quote, left, end quote, support during the Depression. Such notables as G.B. Shaw, Lincoln Steffens were admirers of Mussolini and Hitler, as well as Stalin. George Bernard Shaw, and I don't know who Lincoln Steffens is. George Bernard Shaw was like a playwright, like a Fabian playwright, who yeah. Joseph Lincoln Steffens was an American investigative journalist and one of the leading muckrakers of the progressive era in the early 20th century. He launched a series of articles in McClure's called Tweed's Day in St. Louis that would later be published together in the book titled The Shame of the Cities. Steffens is remembered for investigating corruption in municipal government in American cities and for his leftist values. Anyway, although fascists were generally suffered from bad press since they lost World War II, they did attract significant, quote, left, end quote, support during the Depression. Such notables as George Bernard Shaw and Lincoln Steffens were admirers of Mussolini and Hitler, as well as Stalin, for much the same reasons that Rizzi was. Rizzi's isolation from any real movement, or from the pressure of public opinion, the very fact that he was an eccentric crank, made it easier for him to state openly what playwrights and authors had to express more discreetly. After writing this, I reread some of Shaw's pronouncements on fascism. He was not all that discreet, but then he, too, was treated as an eccentric. Today, it is not only Rizzi's pro-fascism that is out of date. The fascination with state-directed economic activity is not so much in vogue either. Westerby also takes note of this. Westerby points out that Rizzi's sweeping statements are not specific. Quote, he had little sense of the, quote, fine grain, end quote, of the waste and inefficiency engendered by their, bracket, fascist and communist societies, end bracket, routine brutality, end quote. That is to say, up close the appalling living and working conditions of the mass of the population in these societies give the lie to the bureaucracy's grandiose claims. To paraphrase Lincoln Steffens' famous crack, quote, I have seen the future and it works, end quote. It may or may not be the future, but it obviously does not work. Unfortunately, this minor cavil at the end of a long essay which minimizes the political significance and source of Rizzi's fascist sympathies is too little and too late. The state worship Rizzi exemplifies is still with us. It accounts for the nervousness with which the majority of the left reacted to Polish solidarity. After all, were not the Poles threatening nationalized property? While no one was eager to, quote, fight in Jaruzelski's army, there was less reluctance to act as his PR person. In minimizing Rizzi's reactionary but anti-capitalist politics, by translating the rump of an important book, Westerby has contributed to the confusion that surrounds this whole matter. And that's the end of the review. And just if you're still listening, I'm gonna look up how to pronounce this guy's name and like what his
Wojciech Jaruzelski. Wojciech Jaruzelski.
Wojciech Jaruzelski. Wojciech Jaruzelski. Wojciech Jaruzelski lived from July 1923 to May 2014, was a Polish military general, politician, and de facto leader of the Polish People's Republic from 1981 until 1989. Jaruzelski was the first secretary of the Polish United Workers Party between 1981 and 1989, making him the last leader of the Polish People's Republic. Jaruzelski served as Prime Minister from 1981 to 1985, the Chairman of the Council of State from 1985 to 1989, and briefly as President of Poland from 1989 to 1990, when the office of President was restored after 37 years. Jaruzelski was the last commander-in-chief of the Polish People's Army, which in 1990 became the Polish Armed Forces. Wojciech Jaruzelski was born into Polish nobility in Kurów in eastern... God, this fucking biography is long. Yeah, I'm not going to read all this, but, yeah. The end.